I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker, Dr. Stephanie Allais, from the University of the Witwatersrand and from the Center for Researching Education and Labour, which is a research center in the education faculty at Wits University. I've known Stephanie for many years. She's an avid Kenton conference goer, which is now at the Sierra conference. So I meet her every year there. We like chat. But in the year 2007, she finished her PhD, which was on the South African NQF, and it really raised, if you can call it, raised the bar in terms of discussions on the South African NQF, and it was also occurring at the time when there was a lot of work going on in terms of reviewing the South African NQF. And we invited Stephanie to come to one of our PhD weeks in the year 2008, I think, when we were still on the other side there in the other room 20, when it was much smaller. And by the way, this year is 10 years of these PhD weeks. I discovered the other day, which indicates some of us, aging in the. So Stephanie presented her PhD to us in the year 2008, and since then she's gone on to do kind of a postdoctoral work, also continuing the issues that she raised in the PhD. And we've been lucky enough to attract her here straight after publication of this book, which is called Selling Out Education, National Qualifications Framework and the Neglect of Knowledge, which is one of the key issues that she raised in her PhD. So we've invited her to come and talk to us about the book this morning. And over to you, Stephanie. Thank you very much for rushing here and rushing back. She's got teaching this afternoon at 4 o'clock. And she has a 2-year-old, so she's really kind of stepped out of the space to be here with us. So thanks very, very much. We really appreciate that. And by the way, you can buy the book, but only for cash.
Okay. Thank you very much, Hyla. Thank you for inviting me, and thanks also to Sue and Ingrid, who I believe was instrumental in the whole process. It's really great to be here again in what feels like a much more proper university than where I come from. I've got a few little brochures on our little research centre, if anyone is interested in knowing more about what we do at the Centre for Researching Education and Labour. You can come and grab one. And you can also order the book. I just bought a couple of copies, but basically they don't have a local supplier. So you can order it from the Sense website. And I left behind the flyers that I was supposed to bring. But what the flyer says is when you go to the checkout on the online order, you must enter Allais, which is my surname, as a promotion code, and then you get a 30% discount. So, yeah, unfortunately, it's like all academic books, horribly priced. So the 550 Rand that I can sell these for is actually, unfortunately, the 30% discounted price. Can I just check if everyone can hear me at the back? It's quite a big room. Okay. All right, so I'm just going to give you a bit of an overview of some of the research findings as well as some of the conceptual and theoretical issues that I was trying to grapple with in the book. So I want to start with the paradox. And that paradox is, that many people today believe that education is irrelevant. And that people learn more at work or through experience in the real world. We hear this a lot from educationalists as well as in popular discourse. What people need is work experience. You don't use anything that you learn at school. It's a very, very prevalent discourse. And yet, young people today are obliged to enroll for more and more education than ever before, which leads to the phenomenon which we refer to as qualification inflation or credential inflation, whereby you need a much higher qualification to just get your foot into the labour market than what you used to need for the same job. And when people lose their jobs, generally what policymakers say that the solution is retraining. So it's an educational solution. Whereas, on the other hand, education institutions are told that what you're teaching is irrelevant and pointless and it's not preparing people for work. But they can't get into work unless they have higher and higher levels of qualification. So it's a very kind of difficult position. If you look at the statistics, 100 years ago, approximately 30% of the appropriate age cohort was enrolled in primary education internationally. Now that's obviously, much more in some countries and much less in other countries, but around the world it was about 30%. Today, the same number of the appropriate age cohort is enrolled in higher education. So that's an amazing shift over the course of 100 years of incredibly much higher education levels that most people have. So we have the coexistence of rising educational levels everywhere. And also we have the coexistence of youth unemployment. And most people will tell you that youth unemployment is an educational problem. And the reason that we have rising youth unemployment is because the youth do not have the right skills. And it's just an amazing thought if you compare it to how much education they had 100 years ago and how much education they have now. It becomes very difficult to believe that the problem is a lack of education. Nearly all people in all countries around the world today have more education than their parents had. But many of them, perhaps most of them, are less likely to get a secure, well-paying job than their parents were. In the past, people would go and work with low levels of education, and they would gain experience on the job. Now they have to have educational qualifications in order to just get into the queue for work. And the problem is usually described as an educational one. And that's one of the things that I'm trying to look at in this book. And I argue that the problem is an economic one. It's about the structure of our economy and not about the substance of education. But let's put that aside for now. The education institutions are told that, or they believe, they tell themselves, that work experience is more valuable than anything that they can teach, and to the extent that they have a role, it is to prepare people for the workplace. Now, outcomes-based qualifications frameworks seem to be the kind of policy of the moment internationally. One of the reasons for this is that they claim to intervene in this exact problem. They claim to improve the ways in which education systems talk to labor markets and in which education systems talk to workplaces, which are two very different things. And so there's over 120 countries around the world that say that they are in some way involved in developing a qualifications framework. Now, this is a very new phenomenon, and it's a very under-researched phenomenon, so it's hard to say exactly what that means. In some instances, particularly in some European countries, what it means is they've taken their existing system and redescribed it because they were told that they have to relate to the European qualifications framework, and they actually haven't changed much at all. In other countries, particularly developing countries, particularly small developing countries, it means they got a consultant funded by an international donor to write them some level descriptors based on the Scottish level descriptors, and then they say that they've got a qualifications framework. So, we need to be cautious of the claim that, but at any rate, 120 countries say that they're involved in developing qualifications frameworks. And as I said, one of the key things that it is claimed that qualifications frameworks will do is improve education-labor market relationships. They are also claimed to be a mechanism to improve curricula and to improve pedagogy. And a whole host of other educational problems. Okay, so I want to start by talking to you about the South African story, which is, as Hannah said, what I did my PhD on. And I'll start a little further back, going to the early 1990s when I was a student activist, and I was involved in SASCO. I was on the national leadership, and we were very involved in the policy processes, anticipating the transition to democracy. And we believed that we were going to develop these new policies that were going to completely change everything in South Africa. That that it was possible through policy to substantially change stuff. We wanted, and so with there was a flurry of policy development in the early 1990s. And what did we want to achieve in education? We wanted redress because, as we all know, many people in this country were denied access to education. We wanted to increase access to education. We wanted to improve educational quality. And obviously that meant transforming apartheid curricula, which particularly in the school system, but also in some universities, which Wagan mentioned, had been authoritarian, prescriptive, and obviously had taught the world from the perceived interests of the white population. We wanted the possibility of workers to have their skills recognized in the workplace, to open up possibilities for promotion where the color bar had made it impossible for skilled workers to get good jobs. And we wanted more training for workers. Now, the mass democratic movement, many of you know, had a tradition of robust and lively debate. And although many ideas, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later, were being brought from study tours that various people were involved in, there was a sense that we were forging a uniquely South African solution to our problems, which was going to be really amazing and solve everything. So I then left obviously graduated, thankfully, and went to teach high school for a few years. And then I went to work for a trade union as the education officer. And in the union movement, again, we were very involved in education policy. This was at the time when the CETAs were being formulated. They were just an idea that was on the table. And the focus here was on creating a system to recognize and improve workers' skills. And again, the promise was that this was going to overturn the problems in our economy and overturn the legacy of apartheid education. Now, here the international kind of influence starts to become clearer, because the union which was leading this process, NUMSA, was heavily involved in a series of study visits and exchanges and etc. with its counterparts in Australia and New Zealand. And they had heavily bought in, this is under the leadership of Alec Irwin, to the notion of post-Fordism. And the idea of post-Fordism, it's the same as the idea of the knowledge economy or similar, is that, I'm obviously simplifying this a lot, that if we can just raise everyone's skills, everyone will be able to get autonomous, rewarding work, the economy will become much more productive, we'll become competitive internationally, rising prosperity for everyone. So, and NUMSA as a union at that point, it's a very different union today, very strongly bought into that idea, and its education policies were very firmly located in that kind of idea. They were also very firmly located in the systems that were being implemented, particularly in Australia. And the system in Australia was very strongly influenced by the system in the UK under Margaret Thatcher. I'm not going to go into the historical details of that now, but it is detailed to some extent in the book and in more detail in the PhD if anyone is interested in that particular narrative. Okay, so basically the idea was that improving education of the workforce would increase prosperity and workers' autonomy in the workplace, and that's why it was quite attractive to the union movement. Some years later, I was working for an NGO in education and then later a government organization, and I sort of became increasingly convinced that we'd really got things wrong, and increasingly perturbed by the notion of learning outcomes, which is very central to the NQF, and started investigating it more critically and more critically looking at this kind of strange alliance of business and labor that was pushing this idea of an outcomes-based qualifications framework as the solution to workplace training and education and the economy. And and which was presented at the time as the ultimate kind of rainbow nation. We could all come together and develop a policy that was in everyone's interests. And the more I investigated it, the more I began to feel that there were underpinning ideas about education that were dismissing something that is really central and valuable about education. But of course I thought, South Africans, we very, very wedded to the notion of South African exceptionalism. I thought that this was a particularly South African problem, and that the problems of outcomes-based education and the increasing dysfunctionality of our NQF, which became, quite apparent quite early on, was, just because we always, we just got it wrong. And when I was asked by the International Labour Organization to run a comparison of qualifications frameworks in 16 countries around the world, I was convinced that I was going to find different stuff. I'd read some of the literature on England, and I knew there were a lot of problems. I knew there were some problems in Australia, but there isn't that much critical literature around. And what amazed me, number one, is how fast qualifications frameworks were spreading in the absence of any evidence that they could do any of the things that were claimed about them. And the other thing that amazed me was how similar the problems were in country after country. The same problems that we experienced in South Africa, not always manifested in exactly the same way. And the same reasons for wanting a qualifications framework. If you read the official documents from country after country, you'll think you're reading about the same country. And these are countries, if you read the ILO study, and it's available on the website, it's available online. The countries include, the largest country on earth, Russia, and a tiny little island, Mauritius. One of the richest countries in the world. The countries with the highest human development indicators, and the countries with some of the lowest human development indicators, Australia and Bangladesh. And if you read their official descriptions of what is wrong with their education system and their economy, they're the same. And how outcomes-based qualifications frameworks are going to solve those problems, they're also the same. And then the problems with implementation are amazingly also quite similar. So, the first issue was, as I said, the most amazing lack of evidence. So everyone's adopting this policy in an era where the World Bank makes so much noise about evidence-based policy, and the World Bank is a major funder of outcomes-based qualifications frameworks in developing countries around the world. They're funding one in Bangladesh. They funded various disastrous projects in Mexico. You can read the details in our case study. It's also available online. And there is zero evidence. And we could not find any evidence in any of our 16 case studies. And everyone always says, as researchers, that a lack of evidence doesn't necessarily mean that nothing has happened. But when you're approaching the official qualifications authorities who are advocating these systems and running them and asking them, do you have any research that shows anything? And no one can produce anything at all, it starts to seem really strange. So what I wanted to understand is why this idea has been so attractive to policymakers and educationalists, including many progressive educationalists. Because this idea in South Africa particularly came from adult educationalists and union educationalists. Why was this idea so attractive to these left-wing critical educationalists? And one of the things that the evidence shows is that not only are outcomes-based qualification frameworks not beneficial, not only do they not achieve the goals claimed for them, but they can actually be destructive of education systems. And I think what's particularly interesting here is the evidence from the developing world. Because in the developed world, as I said, what often tends to happen is they're not really adopting the policy, or the strength of their institutions means that they can just carry on going regardless. But in the developing world, in many cases, so it's most stark here in South Africa, where in the vocational and workplace training arena, where there was very little provision to start with, and you bring in this as a mechanism to drive provision, and what happens is you end up with no provision. And I'm actually not going to talk about that particular aspect in detail, but if people are interested, we can come back to it. But I think the issue that I just want to highlight for now is that I think what's interesting about this policy phenomenon is that the developing world has a lot to teach the developed world because the problems are not masked. They're much more raw. You know, it's the same as OBE in our school system. The problems with it were so stark and so immediate and so apparent that it just became obvious to educators that this system is just, you know, the emperor's got no clothes. Whereas in Scotland, they're still implementing outcomes and because, you know, the good schools are strong and they've got their curricula and they know what they're doing. In the weak schools in Scotland, actually, it is having some disastrous effects, but it's not nearly as obvious. So I think that's one interesting issue. Okay, so, in practice, qualifications frameworks have not achieved their goals. The people who run them are not able to produce evidence that shows that they achieve their goals, and the people who run them do have evidence of many problems in implementation, and they can tell you about the problems in implementation. But what I wanted to understand is, how does this idea, what are the theoretical problems? Could it work? Is this just a problem of poor implementation? If you ever wonder, why do people believe in this idea that doesn't seem to be working anywhere? And the book is not an argument about why you shouldn't implement an NQF, because most people aren't particularly interested in NQFs. NQFs, you know, I mean, you know, it's just the latest policy fad. But the theoretical issues that the book is trying to unpack is the relationship between economic ideas and epistemological ideas. And one of the things that I'm trying to do in the book, and I was talking about this last night as well for many of you were there, is convince educationalists about the value of organized bodies of knowledge and that a primary role of education is assisting pupils or students to acquire organized bodies of knowledge. And that organized bodies of knowledge should be our starting point in curriculum design. Now, why would anyone need to write a book about that? You might well ask. It seems pretty obvious. Obviously, education is about teaching people knowledge. But in fact, it's anything but obvious. Many of us educationalists in the past and the present have abandoned or neglected the notion of organized bodies of knowledge as the rationale for education and as the starting point in curriculum design. For over 100 years, well more than 100 years, and chapter 2 of the book kind of traces this, and you can read it free online on the Sense website. They put up a couple of chapters free. Educationalists have aimed to recreate the everyday world in the curriculum, arguing that this is better for children. It's more interesting for children. We educationalists have overemphasized competence and skills at the expense of knowledge. We have overemphasized the notion that knowledge is socially constructed, which obviously it is, but we've overemphasized that notion at the expense of any sense that there are bodies of knowledge which are worth acquiring and which give us real insight into the natural and social world. And we have overemphasized, and I know this is a controversial point with educationalists, the extent to which the curriculum expresses ruling class ideology. Now, that doesn't mean that any of those things aren't real issues. Curricula obviously express ruling class ideology, and we obviously need to tackle it. But what I'm arguing is we have overemphasized the extent to which that happens, and we have under-researched the ways in which that happens. So all of those traditions within educational thought thought that learning outcomes could solve the particular problems that they had with education. The need for the everyday, the need for skills and competence, the fact that knowledge is socially constructed and all knowledge is therefore the same, the fact that curricula are dominated by ruling class ideology. Those are all different kind of, I'm obviously crudifying them, bodies of thought within curriculum history, within curriculum thought, and people within those bodies of thought that the idea of learning outcomes could be a useful way of addressing their concerns. And all of this, as I said at the beginning, has a lot of resonance with popular discourse of, the kind of children don't need all these facts. They can look up facts on Google. I've never used the quadratic equations that I learned in school. What was the point of all of that? Schools should teach useful practical stuff. We're trying to hire people and they have no workplace training at all. They just come with all this theoretical knowledge. Very, very prevalent ideas about education. Now, this is not to say that curricula don't need to be reformed, or, as I said, that they don't reflect dominant ideologies, or that we don't need better insights into how to prepare people for work in occupational and vocational and professional education. But what I'm arguing in the book is that the popularity of outcomes and outcomes-based qualifications is that on the one hand, they seem to offer a solution to all of those educational concerns, different concerns which have some overlaps, and they seem to offer a solution to the people who are concerned with workplace productivity because they seem to enable education to match the needs of the workplace. But in fact, they don't offer a solution to any of these concerns, and actually they aggravate the underlying weakness of all of those traditions. And what I'm arguing is that one of the things that all of those traditions have in common, both the different strands of kind of left-wing thought and the right-wing efficiency, productivity, is a neglect of knowledge, a neglect of a proper analysis of bodies of knowledge and how knowledge works and the role of knowledge in education. Okay, so there's lots of problems with this policy mechanism. I mean, there's an unbelievable number of problems with it. And, you can read about them in the book, but I'm just going to talk about two key ones that are really fundamental. The one is that learning outcomes rest on the notion of transparency. Learning outcomes are supposed to be a transparent device that everyone can understand in the same way. And that transparency is central to all the claims that are made for what outcomes-based qualification frameworks can do in improving curricula, pedagogy, labor market relationships, etc. Because the idea is different stakeholders. In some countries, there's a much stronger emphasis on industry. In our context, it was broad kind of notions of stakeholders are supposed to get together and specify the outcomes of educational programs in such a way that the teachers will understand how to teach against those outcomes. The learners will read the outcomes and say, oh, that's what I'll get when I do that qualification. The employers can read the outcomes and say, I can see what this person is qualified to do. Someone in another educational institution can read the outcomes and say, okay, I can see we can admit this person into this program because we can see they're qualified to do all of these things. And a big emphasis at the moment, and particularly in Europe, in the European qualifications framework, if you read all the literature on it, it's going to enable mobility across Europe. Because once you've got learning outcomes, everyone will know what it is that people can do. So the problem with this the one is just a basic practical problem, and the other is epistemological. So the first problem is the basic practical problem is that they aren't transparent. They're not interpreted the same way by everyone. So what happens is more and more specifications to make them more and more clear. And then the more specifications you get, the longer they get, the more detailed they get, the ironically more difficult to read and less transparent they get, till they become these incredibly cumbersome documents. Okay, so just a couple of examples. So these are unit standards from our own glorious qualifications framework. From a range of different areas. Control traffic. Is that a transparent thing? If I say I can control traffic, would everyone know exactly what it is that I can do? Well, no, because, there's different levels of controlling traffic. Manage one's own development. Apply maritime geography. Attend to and handle a domestic violence incident. A lot of different ways in which that could be done, depending on whether you're a cop or a psychiatrist or a neighbor, or, these aren't sort of kind of clear and objective things with a one-to-one correspondence with something in the world. Okay, even the bottom one, which is sweep floors. I don't think you can see it there. Okay, so what happens is specific outcomes have to get added. So here's a unit standard outcome. Facilitate the optimal functioning of a client with a psychiatric disorder. That's the outcome of the unit standard. So specific outcomes get added to try and make sure that everyone understands what it is that we mean when we say that someone is competent in facilitating the optimal functioning of a client with a psychiatric disorder. And then those aren't enough either. So purpose statements get added to say that this qualification is actually aimed at home care workers. And then range statements get added that try and specify where this learning outcome can apply. And then assessment criteria get added so that we can try and see exactly what it is. And then a credit allocation gets added. So, for example, all of this leads to my favorite example ever, which is 15 assessment criteria in washing your hands. And the assessment criteria are detailed in the book if any of you want to see whether or not you are competent in washing your hands. Now, these 15 assessment criteria are attached to one specific outcome. The specific outcome is wash hands effectively. And that is a specific outcome of one unit standard. The unit standard is maintain personal hygiene, health, and presentation. And the unit standard is worth 4 credits at level 1 on the NQF. Now, once you develop that kind of level of specification, the notion of transparency just becomes a joke. Who is going to read that amount of detailed description of what someone can do? And even then, there could still be dispute about, the length of time that you have to apply the soap for under the water, and is it okay if you, wring your hands dry when the towel isn't there, or, whatever it is. Okay. So now, this leads to the second problem, which is epistemological. The notion of knowledge, which is sometimes explicit and sometimes implicit in this system, is that knowledge is bits of information that can be, it's flat, it's all the same. You can take this bit, you can take that bit, you can, you've got to start with the outcome and then choose the bits of knowledge that can lead to that outcome. There's no notion of knowledge as structured, and that is not how bodies of knowledge work. The bodies of knowledge that we teach in educational institutions are organized in conceptual relationships to each other. Yes, they have facts, and yes, facts are important for people to learn, but those facts are embedded in conceptual relationships. They don't exist isolated from those conceptual relationships. Which is not the same thing as saying that subjects and disciplines are static and can't be changed. It's not the same thing as saying that subjects and disciplines are ideology-free and, pure truth. I'm not making any of those statements, but I'm saying that bodies of knowledge are structured and organized, and that organized bodies of knowledge can't be read off those learning outcomes. They can't be built into the learning outcomes by the designers. They can't be read off the learning outcomes by the curriculum designers. So where learning outcomes work, or where, as I say, in many rich countries they are perceived to work, is because people are actually teaching bodies of knowledge and saying, yes, this is the learning outcome, this is the learning outcome, this is the learning outcome. But they're not saying this is the learning outcome, therefore. There isn't a causal relationship between the learning outcome and the body of knowledge. Okay, knowledge is not lists of information. And that's why we have education institutions. That's why we have to teach kids bodies of knowledge, and they can't just look them up on Google. Because on Google they can get the bits, but they can't get the web. They can't get the relationships. And it's hard to understand those relationships. They're structured, they take time. Some of them are more obviously hierarchically organized than others, like maths. You just can't learn calculus if you haven't learned addition. You can't learn it if you haven't learned algebra. But all bodies of knowledge, sociology, the insights of Max Weber depend on the insights of Karl Marx. He didn't agree with everything of Karl Marx. He changed some of it, he revised some of it, but he worked his ideas in. Everything about our knowledge changed after Karl Marx formulated his theories of how the economy relates to society. So it's learning those structural relationships of concepts which is what makes education difficult and which is what makes it worthwhile and powerful. There are various other practical problems with this policy mechanism. One of them that I'll just mention very quickly is the role of employers. And that is that one of the claims here is that education, remember I started off by saying that, this general idea of that education doesn't meet the needs of the economy. The idea is employers will specify the competences that they need in the workplace. Now, the problem with it is, number one, most employers don't want to sit in meetings specifying the competences that they want. So, empirically, what we found in country after country is that employers were not involved in any of the processes. Number two, employers don't know what it is that they want in their workforce. And number three, they have no idea how to produce, to the extent that they do know what it is that they want. They have no idea. They all give lists of wish lists. Oh, we want people who can take initiative and, be team workers and problem solvers, which are not things that education is particularly good at developing. And finally, there is no one employer view. Even in very similar industries, employers have very different ideas. So that's just another practical problem which is explored a little bit more. Okay, so what I'm arguing is that understanding the appeal of this mechanism of the role that outcomes-based qualifications are supposed to play, as well as what the problems are, give us insight into the problems of ideas that have been very influential in the history of educational thought. And specifically, ideas that have been supported by those who see themselves as left-wing and progressive, and how it is that many of the ideas that they have supported have worked so easily and neatly with neoliberal public sector reforms. Okay, so as I've said, what I'm arguing is that one of the key weaknesses in many educational bodies of thought is the neglect or undermining of knowledge. And what the effect of this has, and the reason this works so well with neoliberal public sector reform, is that it creates the idea that education is a malleable activity. It doesn't have an essence. It doesn't have anything specific. Anyone can define it. You can get a bunch of employers to define what it is that they want, and then you can just produce an education program that meets those specifications, or a group of community stakeholders, or a group of students, or whoever it is. It's a malleable thing. once it is such a malleable thing, it becomes very easy to redefine it as a generic service and say that any provider who can meet the learning outcomes can be contracted to deliver that service. So it fits in very well with a particular form of public sector reform, which has been very prevalent in the English-speaking world since the 1970s, which is usually referred to as new public management, where the state is broken up and services are contracted out as much as possible. Because once you lose the sense that there's something specific that these institutions are doing, and in order to do that specific thing, the institutions have to be of a specific type. And once you say, well, this is just a malleable, we can just say what it is that we wanted to achieve, and then people can just achieve it, it becomes very easy to contract out the provision of education. And this was the original explicit rationale of the National Vocational Qualifications in the UK and the competence-based training system in Australia. They explicitly said, we want to marketize our system. We want to break the monopoly that educationalists have on provision and make any market provider be able to contend in this arena. Those two systems, the National Vocational Qualifications in the UK and the competence-based training in Australia, are the basis that nearly all qualifications frameworks around the world have been developed on. Although in South Africa we deny that, and if you go onto the SAQA website, it will say, we did a little bit of policy borrowing, but this is a uniquely South African policy. But if you actually do the tracing, that is where they come from, and that they are exactly the same. The logic is exactly the same, and the problems are exactly the same. So what you get is this notion of the neglect of knowledge or the abandonment of knowledge. I'm sure many of you as educationalists have read, and I was very seduced by, as a student activist, the notions of deschooling and free schooling. School is an oppressive institution. We should free learners to learn in the world. And these notions work very well with neoliberal economic policy, which says we don't want to fund institutions. It's expensive. We can just let people learn and give them certificates for whatever it is that they've learned in the course of work or everyday life. So the idea is a fantasy, a left-wing and a right-wing fantasy of learning unconstrained by institutions and individuals free to choose from a wide range of options, whatever interests them and will be useful to them. The free market fantasy is the same idea. It doesn't lead to the provision of education. And the progressivist fantasy gives moral support to the free market fantasy and enables labeling of opponents as conservative, something which has happened to me a lot, particularly from colleagues who work in qualifications frameworks who say, well, if you don't want them, you're obviously, very right-wing and conservative. What neither set of fantasies take account of is what are the necessary conditions for the acquisition of knowledge? And second, how do institutions emerge to support the acquisition of knowledge? How can institutions be developed and built to support the acquisition of knowledge? And how can they be sustained in poor countries? These ideas are just completely ignored. You just create the qualifications, and I am approached very often. I was approached recently by someone from Save the Children. They have a contract from the European Foundation of a couple of million euros to develop a qualifications framework for Somalia. And what this qualifications framework for Somalia is going to do is develop competence statements of the kind of competences that the young people in Somalia need. And once those competence statements are there, then education provision will be able to happen against them. And the young people of Somalia will have the right skills, and then they'll all get jobs in Somalia will no longer have any problems. So, this is, so now I declined this offer. So Save the Children are now doing this job. They've probably done it already, in fact, from their offices in Europe, because they did point out to me that they're not really going to spend much time in Somalia. It's a bit dangerous. But the logic is that provision will flow, because this is the logic of neoliberal public sector reform. Once you've specified what it is the government will contract people to do, people will do it. And this is exactly what can't happen in something as specific as the process of helping people to acquire organized bodies of knowledge, which requires a very particular kind of specialist in those bodies, particular kinds of institutions which can support people to acquire those bodies of knowledge. Learning, yes, learning happens everywhere, of course. That's what learning is. We're all learning all the time. But education, the point of education is to provide access to knowledge which is not typically acquired in the course of everyday life. Bodies of knowledge in which concepts, principles, and facts are organized in structured relationships with each other, which enable us to step in and out of everyday situations, which enable us to reflect on everyday situations, compare them, analyze them. And it is the structure of these bodies of knowledge which makes them difficult to acquire, sometimes boring, not always have an immediate application in the real world, and which require well-structured curricula, sustained and structured learning in institutions in which, this is another issue which I actually don't talk about in the book, but it's something I'm very passionate about, in which people meet in a room and talk to each other. So the idea that curricula should not be primarily aimed at acquisition of bodies of knowledge or influenced and constrained by the inherent structure, and I'm not saying that that's an easy thing, it's very debated amongst experts. You know, they have huge fights. What is the essential science for grade 10s? It's not an easy question to answer, but it's where we need to start. If we don't start from there, we end up with these fantasies that learning can be acquired in the course of everyday life, and you know, the fantasy of individuals untrammeled by oppressive institutions, which fits in well with the idea that we must contract education delivery to the cheapest possible service provider, or even better, to no one. We just give people certificates. Okay, so now the last point that I want to very briefly talk about, and this was a very difficult issue for me when I was working for the International Labour Organization, because the reason they did this research, and the book talks about my PhD as well as the ILO study. The reason the ILO did this study is because their member countries always come to them and say, we've been advised to develop an NQF, please can you tell us how to go about it? We know some countries have had problems, what's the best way of doing it? So they wanted to know, what is the best way of doing it? And they said, let's do some research to find out what are the best ways of doing it. So I did the research. They were amazing. They were like not trying to control the research or, you know, read positive findings in where there weren't any. The European Training Foundation, who were involved also in the project, did not have exactly the same approach. They wanted it to work. But the ILO, they kept saying to me, all right, so if we're telling our countries that NQFs don't work, what can they do instead? They've got all these problems. How can they solve them if they can't solve them through NQFs? So the first thing I said to them is, the problems are misdiagnoses. You're saying that the problem is with the education system. What are you doing about the structure of the economy? What are you doing about the nature of jobs? What are you doing about the extent to which your labor market is regulated? Because countries that have strong apprenticeships have regulated labor markets. People enroll for apprenticeships in Germany because they know they will get a secure, well-paying, respected job. Not because of something that the education minister did. It's a labor market issue. You know, we have this constant discourse, and it's very prevalent in NQFs. NQFs will raise the status of vocational education. You don't raise the status by doing as our beloved minister does. Colleges are great, everyone! They're great! Send your children to them! That's not how you raise the status of vocational education. You raise the status of it by regulating your labour market so that people can get protected jobs in mid-level artisanal work. Then it's a desirable thing to do, and it is desirable in Switzerland and in Germany, not that they don't have problems, but large numbers of school leavers choose to enroll in those programs. They are not low status. Okay, so the first thing I say is that the list of problems that NQF say they will solve, the problems are misdiagnosed. That's the first thing. The second thing is there is no magic bullet. Okay, so NQFs won't solve all of these problems. There is no other policy that will solve them. But I do, in the very last chapter of the research, consider. Oh, whoops, sorry, that was the last slide. Anyway, a couple of ideas for things that could be done differently. And the main thing that I really argue for is different economic policies that support industrial development and the development of economies aggressively and directly, and the support of building education institutions. If you want provision of education, you've got to build institutions. You've got to support institutions, you've got to fund them, and you can't expect them to have a short-term and narrow relationship with the immediate needs of your labour market. There's all sorts of roles that education plays in society and in the economy. From the basics of ensuring that people are literate and numerate to the development of research and innovation. And all of these are important. And yes, they play a huge role in the economy. And they play a huge role in society. I'm not saying there's no relationship between education and the economy. But, and this is perhaps to end on a kind of apparent paradox, I think it's more likely that education will be able to play these roles if it is valued for what it can do, which is supporting the acquisition of bodies of knowledge, and not if it is expected in the narrow short-term way to solve social and economic problems. The acquisition of bodies of knowledge is the basis for the integrity and intelligibility of education, and this is an internal justification for knowledge separate from the economy and the short-term needs of society. I think it's part of a common core of humanity. But I also think that if we see education in that way, and if we build and nurture education in that way, it is obvious that it will play all sorts of important and unpredictable positive roles in society and the economy.
Okay, so we can take some questions. Thank you very much, Stephanie, for that fantastic lecture. Any questions, Stephanie? Yes, we'll make a couple of questions and we can respond.
Thank you, Stephanie, for the presentation. It was very eye-opening. But I want to start by making a confession that I'm one of the people who have been involved in the development of the NGO.
I was also.
I've got a lot of questions, I'm sorry. My first one is just to understand what is meant by knowledge. And the second one is to understand what are the bodies of knowledge. And the third one is to understand what is the purpose of education. That is just the basic one, the basics one. But they are, I just want to make another confession. there is something that attracted me to the workings of the MQF. The first one is the fact that we were working and we had bosses. Some of us were not educated enough, and the bosses were educated. But the issue is that most of the work was done by us who were not educated. The bosses were not doing the work. And therefore, one of the things the NQF initiated was that it needed to and the uneducated were paid very little, doing all the work. And the bosses were getting big monies, not doing the work being done by the uneducated. And the issue which attracted me to the M2F was the fact that those who are doing the work, they've been doing the work all these years. They don't have the education, but they are experienced in doing the work, and they are doing it. And the underpinning thing there was that the work they have done and the experience they have need to be considered so that they get a little bit more pay. So that's what attracted me much, because I was feeling that there's a lot of people who are doing the work for a small pay with a lot of experience, and those who've got bodies of knowledge who are not doing the work but who are paid more big monies. I think that was attractive for me.
Can I respond, because it's already about 4 questions there?
She has not finished.
No, there's a lot of other.
I mean, I think that is one of the appeals. And that's also why it appealed to me. When I was working for, as I said, I was working for the union movement. The problem is it doesn't solve that problem in any way. It does not solve that problem. All that it does, it does one of 2 things. It gives workers certificates and then they carry on being paid nothing. That's the best possible outcome. Or it gives workers certificates and then denies them access to training because, look, you've got a certificate. We don't need to train you. We don't need to provide any education to you. The problem is a labor relations issue. It's a power issue. You can't solve it through an education policy. And there's no evidence. We looked at 16 countries. There is not one in which workers got RPL for their skills and then got better positions at work. In Chile, there was the most success with RPL. In Chile, some learners said they had better self-esteem after getting the RPL. Didn't change their salary structure, didn't change the structure of their job, didn't change the nature of their job. If you have a very regulated labor market, it could. If you have a very tightly controlled labor market, and this does operate in some European countries whereby qualifications earn you a right to more pay, then there's some possibility, but usually employers will find a way around it. They'll say, well, yes, you've got these skills, but you don't have, it doesn't change the power relationships of the workplace. So I totally agree with you. And I think that's why I think it's an interesting policy mechanism to study, because it seems very appealing. It seems like it does all of these great things, but it doesn't do them in practice. And I just want to give you one particular example of RPL, which came up in the ILO study. And this was of traditional dancers in Botswana. The traditional dancers in Botswana, the Botswana Vocational Qualifications Authority went to a lot of trouble to develop unit standards in Botswana so that traditional dancers could get recognized for the skills and knowledge and competence that they have as dancers. And then they were assessed against it, and they were all awarded certificates. And there was a big ceremony, and, you know, everyone was very happy. And then the traditional dancers came to the Qualifications Authority and said, now what can we do with our certificates? And they were told, you can be traditional dancers. Which is what they were, to start with, before they had the certificates. And, you know, the problem with what you're saying is, when people have been denied, there's two issues. The one is people have been denied access to education. Some people have been given access, other people haven't. Giving the people who have been denied access to education a certificate doesn't give them that education. If you're saying that people really do have skills that are being ignored in the workplace, that's a workplace issue. It's a labor relations issue. It's a power issue. You can't solve it. And there's just no evidence that it has been solved and that it's done the things which I totally agree with you. And I also have to confess that I was also completely seduced by. Just want to very quickly answer your other two questions. The one is, what do we mean by knowledge and bodies of knowledge? What are bodies of knowledge? What I'm talking about when I say bodies of knowledge are organized bodies of knowledge like subjects or disciplines, which are organized in conceptual relationships with each other. Mathematics, science, the various branches of science, but also which can be organized, drawing on those organized bodies of knowledge to look at a particular issue in the world, like engineering is a body of knowledge which draws on other bodies of knowledge, math, science, and so on. Now, you know, bodies of knowledge are constantly shifting and developing and changing. They are socially developed. They're developed by people engaging with each other and in real-world problems, but they are organized and they are different to the knowledge that is learned in the everyday world. And that's very simplistic and crudifying a whole lot of nuanced issues. But I think analytically it's useful to kind of try and draw some sharp distinction, and then obviously in practice there's blurring and there's boundaries and so on.
Knowledge.
A question on that, what you just
Yes.
said. Why are you advocating that? Why are you advocating those acquisition of bodies of knowledge?
Why?
Yeah.
Because I think you can do a lot of useful things with them, and because they are intrinsically empowering. So if you learn about cells, and you learn about chemistry, and you learn about physics, you can cure diseases. You can't cure diseases you can, to a very limited extent, look at experience in the everyday world, and you can learn that this bark helps stomach cramps and this leaf helps. But you can cure diseases a lot more if you can learn those bodies of knowledge which have been developed by people all around the world over the course of, you know, centuries. They are useful. They are empowering. Like if you learn sociology and you learn the theories of Marxism, and you're a worker in a factory, you can analyze your position. You know, C. Wright Mills, the American sociologist, talks about the distinction between personal problems and structural issues in society. And if you don't have any kind of tools of analysis that you can get from bodies of knowledge, then your problems in the workplace, my boss is horrible to me, I earn nothing, my life is awful. But if you can analyze that, it's empowering. It doesn't necessarily mean that it will immediately enable you to solve it, but it is still empowering to be able to look at your situation and reflect on it and critique it and understand why it is that some people are able to extract the surplus value of other people's labor. So, you know, if we don't believe that, let me throw the question back to you. If we don't believe in acquiring bodies of knowledge, why is it that we need to bring people together in education institutions? Why don't we just release them and let them learn? Or let them, I don't know, dig ditches or something? What is the point of it? if what you learn in everyday life is just the same.
I follow on from what you've just been saying, so that's very interesting. I can't help wondering what Paulo Freire would have to say about the situation at the moment. So I was very interested in seeing how you took it up into the socio-economic context, where we've got a frightening Gini coefficient that just is a big warning, where we've got the Occupy movement, where we've got angry, unemployed youth around the world. And for me, this system seems to support the status quo. We're basically creating a commodification of knowledge. You've got learners as consumers, and they're not being taught to be critical thinkers. They're not being taught the ability to question or to learn or to analyze they're being taught facts and skills. And I think a system like this is hugely attractive if you're wanting to keep things as they are.
Yeah, I mean, that's basically what Gramsci said. He said when he was critiquing the progressivist curriculum reforms in Italy that were introduced by the fascist government, and they introduced, group learning and no subjects, integrated curriculum, blah, blah, blah. And Gramsci said, if you want to keep people oppressed forever, don't teach them their history. Because then they'll never know how it is that you're keeping them oppressed. So, I mean, yeah, I agree. So that's why I do think that bodies of knowledge are intrinsically and inherently empowering and useful. And not teaching them, just teaching a focus on the everyday and re-describing the everyday in education just keeps people trapped in the everyday, which is where they started.
Sorry. 4, 5, 6 questions.
Okay, I'll try.
Thank you for the answer. I've got another question. When I look at the way you are explaining the bodies of knowledge, it's like they are high up on the hierarchy. That is at university or post-matric level. And what are we saying about those people who were disadvantaged and dropped out of schools or were having no funding to get to the schools, to the universities? Because you are saying they need to get to there and get to the board and get the bodies of knowledge, and I don't think they can have an ability to go back because they are a bit old. What are you proposing that we can have for them?
Okay.
Okay. Question number 2. Yes.
Okay, thank you. For me, I'm looking at the purpose of an education, and I'd like us to reflect on the Somalia example you gave. And I'm just wondering if you would assume that maybe one of the reasons of an education is to get people to become good, responsible citizens, like just over time. And if I worked for, hypothetically, the Foreign Affairs Department in South Africa, and we were a country that cared about other African countries, and we need to do something about Somalia. Of course, there are security issues in that country. We'll be able to send South Africans over there, and if not, well, what exactly are we going to do then? Would we rather do something wrong with good intentions, or would we rather not do anything because we do not agree with the methodology? And as if we're waiting for a really good or best or ideal way of handling this situation. My argument is within setting up schools or learning environments, help build some kind of a structure. And even though the curriculum is not perfect, usually teaching is done by members of the community to be able to connect graduates. So I'm just looking at the Somalian situation and saying, maybe it's better to do something and learn as we go by developing this community. Thank you.
Us to stop being knowledge blind. For people to be together in face-to-face spaces, which I gather was a little coming by MOOCs.
Yeah.
And I wondered if there's
Okay.
anything for you to say something.
Thank you. President Paul. Thanks for a very thought-provoking presentation. Maybe because I studied history and sometimes I feel that certain analysis that are done in the contemporary sometimes overlook the political context and the space within which these processes happened and their congruence within those periods. Because like in Fundi and we were quite together and I was working at parks. And I think, and I was not dealing with children. And I think if within the political context, teachers and workers who were responsible for education in the park system did not have self-esteem, then that was a very positive part because most of them were either typists or they were rangers, and that self-esteem, because when I work with uni standards, I work with the very rangers. So that process of sitting around the table with them and creating that self-esteem and understanding the complexity, because developing those uni standards are very, very complex. And there was an osmosis of relationship with the sharing of the context within the working in, and me at head office as an administrator, and understanding the context and sharing the sort of tiny context of being at head office and understanding the context. Because at the same time, that allowed the relationship to happen at an administrative level, so that somehow the other influences what's happening at that level of relationship. And I think that in itself, maybe what was misleading was the expectations, broader expectations at an industry level. But fair to say, Taylor was involved, Rita, Rob, and a number of people that we were working with. But fair to say that most of these people that I worked with, 35 of them, were just zapped up by other institutions and were taken over, and it was another training phase that had to happen. So that particular training itself allowed fluidity of people out of certain ways of thinking, certain way of thinking about the job, and a self-esteem and a better relationship. So I think we need to also, in our analysis, not throw the baby out with the water, but also look at the really great successes that came out of the engagement. Because for the first time in South Africa, people were allowed. You remember that time there was a lot of workshops talking and all. All of a sudden, people had a voice. People could talk. And that was very, very important in that particular time. And I think we need to reflect back at that particular time and harvest the gains and document those gains.
Number 5, question number 5.
My comment.
Sorry, I was carrying just submerged in that. Thank you. I agree with your political analysis as to why both left wing and right wing found it very attractive to go there. I fully agree. I think it's fantastic. I'm always curious about how those left wing got into that. But that's another issue. what I'm worried about is there seems to be a polar swing from celebrating everyday knowledge as a firming identity that was the past, to now the other extreme, we have to uphold systematic organized knowledge. For us in education, the issue is really not dichotomizing the two, but what is the real relation, the epistemological relation between everyday knowledge and organized knowledge. And I don't think you have addressed that. You have only addressed the polarization between the two. What's the connection?
Stephanie, you're absolutely spot on in your analysis, but when you spoke about power relations and that the power relations are not effective when it comes to certification, I do feel that power relations are effective because employers can actually become more and more distrustful of certificates and qualifications, and they become very, very skeptical even of degrees. And there's an increasing resistance on the part of their employers to hire people because they don't actually trust what they're reading or what they're seeing. Thank you.
Okay, thanks everyone. There's a lot of really interesting issues. I'll go through them in order. What am I proposing for people who have been denied access to education? I mean, I think that's a question for all of us. What can we do for people who've been denied access to education? I think if people want education, we should help them to get education. If they want something else, we should try and design a society which helps them to get that other thing that they want. You know, I think the problem with the way education works in capitalist economies is that because it's used as a sorter for the labour market, people believe that once they get it, they'll get into the labour market. And that isn't true. It's used as a sorter for the labour market. Employers use education qualifications in different ways, as screening devices, as, you know, so it depends. What is it that those people want? I think that's the starting point. Do they want to learn maths? Then let's help them to learn maths. Let's build institutions. Let's build adult education institutions that help people to learn a curriculum which is more appropriately organized for their needs. Obviously, it needs to be different to the maths curriculum that is designed for young kids. If that's what they want, if they want something else, let's help them. Do you see what I'm saying? It's not a, I don't have a magic solution that we can't give them RPL and certificates, therefore I'm going to give them this. I don't think it's an easy thing, but I do think that relates to the very last question. And it's the problem of, the problem is that when education is used as a sorting device for the labour market, it leads to credential inflation. And so, for example, there's a very interesting book that you might want to look at by some colleagues in the UK called The Global Auction. And what they look at is the hiring practices of multinational institutions. And they go and they interview all these top HR people in all these top multinationals, and they all have this book on their bookshelf called The War for Talent. And the war for talent, and all these HR people tell these researchers, it's Hugh Lauder from the University of Bath, Phil Brown, and David Ashton, they tell them, you know, we're engaged in a war with our competitors, we're trying to get the best possible applicants. So what they do is very simple. They only hire graduates from 6 universities in the world. Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, one university in China that I can't remember, one university in India, and one other university in the US. Now, this is not because those are the only people who have the skills to do the jobs that they're looking for. It's because they're using education as a sorting device, and they want the people who've made it to the very top of the pile. Now, there's nothing you can do. There is no education reform that you can do that will change that. There is nothing you can do at Rhodes University that will make that multinational company hire your graduates. There is no curriculum reform that you can engage in because it is not an educational problem. It's a problem of employers want a screening device, education is perceived as the best proxy for sorting, and there's various, there's slightly different ways in which educational credentials are used. There's at least 6 different ways, so this is one, that employers use educational credentials as a way of sifting through. They don't want to interview hundreds of people. Hundreds of graduates, thousands of graduates have the right skills. They don't want to interview them all. So they think, what's the easiest way of finding out that these are the best possible graduates? We'll just go to the universities that are the hardest to get into, and we're going to get, therefore, the cleverest people. It's not a statement that the education that they're getting is different at those institutions to what they're getting at hundreds of other very prestigious, very good universities. So, all that I'm trying to say is that we need to look at education, I agree, in its context, and not be very wary when someone tells you that a problem is an educational problem, about how can this be solved by changing education. So, okay, moving on to Somalia, I am not advocating that we should not help other people, or that, we have to have the one best solution. I think helping to build education institutions is a wonderful thing to do. All that I think, though, is that qualifications frameworks don't lead to the building of education institutions. I think any reform, any donor agency which could fund the building of schools is great, and the paying of teachers, and the training of teachers, and the buying of books. I think that's fantastic. I think there's lots of other things that you need to do. I don't want to get into political science, and I'm not an expert on it. But I'm not by any means saying let's not help people. All that I'm saying is that this isn't the best starting point, and its logic, the logic of the starting point, does not lead to the building of institutions. It leads away from the building of institutions. But having said that, I think the point about, well, has it achieved something, and let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater, I agree. And I think that one of the things that the SGB process did, I had a colleague who was, when I was starting my PhD, I worked with someone who was on the SGB for teacher education. And, one of the amazing things about the process was that people talked to each other for the first time from different universities. So I think that is, in fact, I think that's one of the few things that NQFs can do and have done, is got people together in a room to talk to each other. And I think that is important in all countries, and it was particularly important for us at that moment in time. So I completely agree with your point. And if you look at the Scottish qualifications framework, which is the most successful in the world, basically it was emerged as a very organic process of institutions getting together and talking to each other. Universities getting together and talking about their qualifications. Universities and colleges getting together and discussing, what is it that you're doing? Can you tell us more about this course? Okay, maybe that does actually prepare students for this course that we're doing. Now, at the end of the day, they come up with a set of level descriptors and learning outcomes. Those things could play some useful role to people who have been involved in those processes and have developed a shared understanding of them. They're not going to play a role to someone who comes in from the outside and tries to use them, which is, the Scottish level descriptors, as I said at the beginning, you can find them in small Polynesian islands, where Australian consultants have tweaked them a little bit for the level descriptors of lots of different countries around the world. They don't mean anything in those contexts. So I'm not saying that there's no value to people getting together, talking to each other, developing more, but I do think that it is a pity that the thing that they're getting together to talk about is only learning outcomes. And in Scotland, in fact, it wasn't. They were engaged in very detailed discussions about the content of their courses in order to understand how vocational colleges could relate to higher education. The Europeans are trying to use learning outcomes to help people to move across European countries. There's a lot of rhetoric about how it will help them, which is quite funny because at the same time, the European Union issues directives. All European countries will recognize nurses from all other European countries. Once you've issued a directive like that, you really don't need a qualifications framework because they can move. And if you don't issue that directive and you have a qualifications framework, chances are they won't be able to move. So what I'm trying to say is, yes, we need to talk to each other, people who work in different institutions, people in workplaces and people in education institutions need to talk to each other. And yes, that was an achievement of our NQF and it has been an achievement of other NQFs. And maybe we wouldn't have done it if we hadn't had an NQF. But without undermining the value of that process, I think that in future we should get together and talk about something else. That is not, again, to undermine the importance of self-esteem for workers. I'm not saying that that's a non-issue. It's not a non-issue. Self-esteem is important. I am saying that there's not good evidence to show that people have got clear career progression. And I'd like to talk to you more about whether it was the training that people were given that enabled them to move, taking people through a process of making their skills explicit and recognizing them is, I think it's great. I think it's wonderful. It's very costly and it's very time consuming, but where it can be done, I think it's great. And so I'm not trying to undermine the value of that, but where you have very limited resources, and maybe this goes back to your question about what do we do for the people who've been denied access, where you've got very limited resources, is it better to spend those resources on time-consuming processes to help individuals recognize the skills that they have, or to provide education to people who've been denied access to education? I think that's a difficult decision, but it's a decision that we have to confront if we've got limited resources. Yeah, and then just very briefly, what are the relationships between everyday and organized knowledge? I mean, yes, I don't deal with it, and yes, I think it's something that we need to deal with as educators. It's an epistemological issue, and it's also obviously a very crucial pedagogical issue. How do we relate? When do we bring in the everyday? When do we not bring in the everyday? When do we distance ourselves? When do we use examples? When don't we? I think those are complicated and very important debates. So I'm not, I don't have the answers to your questions, but I do think it's a really important question, and I do think it's a question that we as educators need to grapple with and take very seriously. But we can't take it very seriously if our starting point is a policy mechanism which implicitly thinks that they're the same. Yes, we've got a lot of work to do, definitely.
So, Stephanie's shuttle is arriving in 1 minute. If you can do it in 1 minute, then...
I think the key thing to me was this taking on the neoliberal policy mechanism and the way it sort of
I didn't answer the MOOCs.
within a transparent stipulative process that is criteria referenced, but then can be denied. You see that? It's the neoliberal policy mechanism that I think is at the center. And it would be interesting to explore the way that that becomes a system of denial when it should be a system that is free of producing. And the way that that mechanism operates to produce transparent stipulations and conflations that produce that denial.
Yeah, that is very interesting. Can I just say something about MOOCs quickly?
Okay.
It's totally unrelated to this book. I mean, I've got a paper on large classes and MOOCs. You could look at it, I could email it to you. But yeah, I think that MOOCs are just, I mean, it's fueled by qualification inflation. I don't think MOOCs are education. I just think it's, so my starting point is always Randall Collins, the American sociologist, who traced the development of knowledge over the course of 2,000 years in all cultures around the world that have got written records. And one of the things that he demonstrates empirically, I mean, the book's that thick. It's a great book. It's really recommended, but it's a long read. He demonstrates empirically that in all the countries around the world over the last 2,000 years, key moments of knowledge development have happened when people have been in physical interaction with each other. Obviously, knowledge development happens when they're not, when you're writing and reading and etc. But it doesn't happen in the absence of people agreeing with each other or disagreeing with each other in physical proximity with each other. I think that you can get a lot online by, particularly the more advanced you are as a learner, you can go and look up something, listen to a particular talk, go over a particular explanation of a particular problem. And yes, I know it's so wonderful because you can rewind and you can't rewind your lecture, and you can have a chat room and it's so interactive and all of that stuff. But I think that, number one, there's a fetishization of technology, which is, I'm not saying we can't do things, we should use technology. But I don't think that education can easily happen in the absence of physical interaction.
Thank you very much.